Knights, often celebrated for their martial prowess alone, led multifaceted lives beyond the battlefield, deeply intertwined with feudal responsibilities, courtly culture, and the pursuit of chivalric ideals. In times of peace, they managed vast estates, administered local justice, and served as patrons of the arts, contributing to the culture and economic development of medieval society. Of course, their daily routines included rigorous training to maintain physical fitness and mastery of skills, participation in tournaments that showcased their valor and refined combat techniques, and engagement in religious observance, which reinforced that moral framework of chivalry. It's through the diversity of these roles that knights not only upheld the social order of the feudal system, but also played a part in shaping the cultural and political landscape of their time. Now, today we're going to learn all about what knights were doing when they weren't charging headlong into the fray. If you like this kind of content, and if you want to learn more, like and subscribe, tell me your thoughts in the comments, and perhaps check out the Patreon if you feel the need to do so. But let's get nice and relaxed first. Go back to the Middle Ages for an hour or so. The image of the knight, wearing armor, charging bravely into battle. That's typically what we think of when someone brings up the topic. But it wasn't always like that. During times of peace, these warriors performed a wide range of tasks and activities, spending large portions of their lives away from the battlefield. In fact, in peacetime, a knight's day-to-day activities were anything but idle or frivolous. Knights maintained the cultural religious standards of their class, while juggling their roles as warriors, landowners, vassals, and of course, don't forget, family men. When there was no war to fight, a knight's days were filled with both utilitarian duties and also sophisticated hobbies. A normal day might consist of a hunt in the afternoon, administrative meetings by noon, weapons practice in the morning, and prayers in the evening. Knights, of course, engaged in courtly life, diplomacy, and local government, in addition to maintaining their physical health and fighting skill. As members of the nobility, they were supposed to be patrons of the church, leaders of their communities, and let's not forget, models of chivalry. So, over the following hour, we'll examine the various aspects of the everyday life in peacetime. What was it like to be a knight off the field? Ranging from family life, to cultural interests, to training regiments, and even their estate administration. First, let's talk about the physical conditioning and training. Knights continued, of course, to be committed to martial art training and physical fitness even during times of peace. After all, a time of peace, for a knight, is just a time to prepare for war. There's always another one around the corner in medieval times, that's for sure. They were aware that maintaining their combat skills was essential as professional warriors. Many knights practiced their swordplay in drills for hours each day. To prevent severe injuries, they used wooden swords or blunted weapons when sparring with partners, who were frequently other knights or their own squires. They improved their skills with swords, axes, and maces through these simulated battles. Horsemanship was equally important in a knight's everyday life. Group practice melees were also common, allowing knights to mimic battlefield conditions and maintain coordination when fighting alongside their comrades. In order to strengthen their relationship with their war horses and hone their riding abilities, knights would also practice this each day. On horseback, they rehearsed skills like charges, sharp turns, and leaps. Tilting at quintain, a rotating target used to practice lance strikes, was a common training exercise too. A knight would charge at a mannequin or spinning shield and attempt to strike it directly with his lance. The weighted arm of the device could swing around and knock him off his saddle if the strike was improper or too slow. Of course, it's one way to learn the hard way and encourage him to increase his timing and accuracy. A knight's ability to couch a lance and aim accurately at an opponent while riding at full speed was refined in these exercises. In addition to weapons drills, knights underwent intense physical training to increase their strength and stamina. To increase one's overall physical strength and close fight skills, wrestling and grappling were popular practices. Knights also trained in heavy armor to get used to it so their bodies wouldn't become too tired from the weight of it in actual combat. Hunting was a sport, but also a form of exercise for them too. A knight's endurances and reflexes were put to the test while pursuing a stag or boar on horseback, which served as beneficial war training. The habit of regular exercise was ingrained in knights since the majority of them started their combat training as boys. Knights made sure that they were always prepared for the demands of the battle by maintaining a rigorous training regimen during peacetime. Notably, this commitment to training started early. Noble boys joined knightly training as pages and squires, where they learned combat arts and discipline from an early age. This regiment of martial practice not only maintained their fighting edge, but also gave them a way to release their energy and competitive spirit during extended periods of peace, not to be too softened up by these times. A knight's daily workouts as an adult were merely just a continuation of his childhood routines, keeping him constantly prepared for battle. And of course, moving on from this, we also have the social duties, the proper conduct of a knight. After all, there were expectations. Knights were supposed to participate actively in noble society when they weren't fighting. Vassals carried out a number of social duties that maintained the feudal order as they were sworn to lords and, eventually, the king. Whenever called upon for significant occasions or councils, a knight would routinely appear at his lord's court, whether it was his king's palace or a local baron's hall. Knights were supposed to represent chivalry and proper conduct at court. The extent to which they did, well, that depends on the actual knight himself, as some found these codes to be a little bit too stifling, too many rules. At banquets and ceremonies, they wanted to adhere to rigorous protocol, which included using appropriate titles, bowing to superiors, and acting politely. Particular attention was paid to a knight's behavior towards women. He was supposed to be honorable, brave, and protective. As part of the courtly love tradition, he might, for example, give a noble lady a token of respect, or dedicate a contest victory to her. Knights were distinguished as civilized gentlemen, rather than just fighters, by their refined behavior. After all, anyone can beat somebody up, drag them off their horse, but it takes a special somebody to give them a hand up afterwards, and teach them how to do it better. It reminds me of being in a mosh pit at a metal concert, actually. It's kind of the same thing, perhaps not. Well, back to the topic. There was a practical aspect to court life as well. Knights would socialize with other nobility and form networks of friendship and loyalty by attending feasts, festivals, and other celebrations that their lords threw. These meetings provided a forum for local politics, distant news, and alliance building. By attending a neighboring lord's daughter's wedding or his liege's lord's festive feast, a knight was strengthening his ties of duty and allegiance. Being present and polite at these events was part of a knight's duty during a period when interpersonal relationships were the glue that held politics together. During peacetime, knights occasionally functioned as advisors and diplomats. A lord may designate a trusted knight to represent him at a far-off court, deliver messages to another noble, or negotiate a small treaty. Knight statuses allowed them to speak to other nobles as peers, perhaps not as equals all the time, but at least in the same or around about the same level. Their word also carried weight, as they were bound by honor. In local affairs, a knight could mediate conflicts between families or nearby landowners in an effort to keep feuds from turning violent. In addition, knights advised their superiors during councils or parliaments. The council of seasoned knights on matters of military or local concern was respected, but the ultimate decisions were made by a baron or king. Throughout these encounters, a knight maintained awareness of his honor and reputation. He would also witness charters and legal agreements, effectively attesting to transactions or settlements by the presence and sworn word. In a society where interpersonal relationships were valued highly, loyalty, respect, and keeping one's word were essential. Perhaps we can learn a little bit from that society. An insult at court or a diplomatic blunder could damage a knight's reputation or even start a feud. Thus, maintaining knightly qualities of integrity, courtesy, and honesty was another way that peacetime social duties were exercised. After all, not getting on the wrong side of the wrong people, that is a battle in itself. Of course, in addition to being landowners, the majority of medieval knights possessed fiefs or estates, which were given to them in return for their years of military service. During times of peace, a knight's daily activity revolved around managing these lands. In actuality, a knight's main source of wealth was usually the money he received from his estates, which he used to maintain his equipment, provide for his family, and carry out feudal obligations. A knight's estate typically comprised of one or more villages with peasants, serfs, or perhaps free tenants who worked the land. As a result, in the absence of war, a knight frequently served as a land manager, or lord of the manager supervising agriculture, finances, and justice on his domain. A knight would oversee the agricultural cycle, frequently with the assistance of a steward or a bailiff. On a daily basis, this meant making sure that crops were harvested effectively, that livestock were taken care of, and that fields were plowed and sown in the appropriate season. Knights were informed about crop yields, grain stocks, and any problems that affected plants or animals such as drought, floods, or disease. They had to decide how best to manage their resources, such as whether to clear new land for farming or when to rotate crops. Peasants performed the physical labor, but a watchful knight would ride among the fields to check on the work, be present, and answer any questions his tenants might have. The manor's economy also depended on livestock, including pigs, sheep, and cattle, so the knight also monitored animal husbandry. Since a thriving estate meant more money to support his knightly duties, he essentially served as an agricultural manager. Doesn't sound like much for a knight to do, but it's important work. Another important duty, of course, was financial management. The people who lived on the knight's land paid him rent and feudal duties. These payments may take the form of cash, livestock, other goods, or a share of the harvest. In times of peace, a knight monitored the accounts of his manor to determine the health of his estate. This included counting livestock heads, tallying grain in storage, or going over income and expense records. Illiterate knights might consult written account rolls, while illiterate knights, who would depend on stewards or clerics to keep track of them. So, in any case, the lord of the manor needed a clear picture of his finances to make plans for the future, whether those plans included funding a daughter's dowry, or buying a new suit of armor, or getting ready for a possible lean year. Land ownership also came with administrative and legal responsibilities. Knights' estates had a manorial court. The knight or his designated representative would arbitrate disputes between the peasants and uphold the rights of the lord in these local courts, which were held on a regular basis, possibly monthly or seasonally. Common issues could be disputes over property lines, inheritance issues, and instances of small-time theft and misbehavior. To administer justice equitably, the knight needed to be knowledgeable about local laws and customs. Everyday problems were settled at the manor level, but major crimes might be reported to higher authorities. Maintaining the estate's infrastructure was another daily concern. By serving as judge and protector, the knight strengthened his authority and ideally gained the respect of the people living on his land, or perhaps risked their resentment if he was perceived as unfair or harsh. Since mills, bakeries, smithies, and other crucial establishments were frequent sources of revenue or essential services for the community, knights made sure they were kept in good condition on their properties. If the knight lived in a castle or other fortified manor house, he was also responsible for maintaining it. This covered everything from fixing gates, walls, or moats to keeping enough food in storage. Castles required upkeep and a small garrison to be prepared for any trouble, such as banditry or local unrest, even in times of peace, because in times of peace, the banditry does not stop. His fortifications, and the men who guarded them, were routinely examined by a conscientious knight. Traveling between properties could be a regular occurrence for knights who owned several estates. They might spend a few weeks at one manor before relocating to another to see how things were going there. But not every knight was wealthy enough to own many manors or big castles. That's ridiculous. There were different kinds of knights, of course, and they were not all as well off as the other. Of course, the knight's estate also had to support his feudal obligations upward, and some only had a small manor house and one village under their lordship. Still not bad, but they largely had to run these alone. For instance, the knight's effective management of agriculture and rents allowed him to fulfill his obligations to his liege lord, who might have demanded a period of military service or a payment known as a scutage in lieu of service. A knight who practiced good stewardship in peacetime was able to support his household and prepare for battle when the time came, if the time came. Doing all this without placing an undue burden on the peasants. But of course, it's not all business. They gotta have a little bit of fun, don't they? In peacetime, knights engaged in a wide range of recreational pursuits. Despite their numerous duties, you must find time to relax. Of course, hunting was the most popular noble activity among them. In order to find deer, wild boar, or other game, knights would plan hunts in game parks and forests on their estates. They would frequently do this while riding horses and using trained hounds. Exciting activities like riding, tracking, and archery or spear throwing were all well practiced during a hunt. It was a source of fresh meat, too, for the table, and an exciting sport. A successful hunt was a source of pride. Hunting with trained birds of prey, or falconry, that was another esteemed pastime, and quite a skill on its own. In an exciting demonstration of skill, a knight may spend his mornings wearing a hawk or falcon on his glove, releasing it to swoop after ducks or rabbits. These outdoor activities were also social occasions, kind of like the modern equivalent of playing golf in our modern era. A lord could call nearby knights together for a large hunt, transforming the wilderness chase into a chance for friendly competition and camaraderie. While knights resorted to indoor entertainment and socializing on festive days or after sunset, feasts were typically to commemorate family holidays or holy days. A knight and his guests were treated to a sumptuous feast that included several courses of delectable food and beverages, as well as storytelling and musical entertainment. Can't go without the lute player, by the way. In the great hall, minstrels or troubadours performed romantic epics and sung ballads of valiant acts. Chivalric ideals the knights aspired to were reinforced and entertained by tales of noble love and legendary warriors, such as Charlemagne's paladins or King Arthur's Round Table, this kind of thing. Additionally, jesters might be there to lighten the mood and make people laugh with jokes. Following a meal, knights and women would dance together in stately medieval dances, which gave the knights a chance to show off their civility and grace rather than fighting skills. For more subdued activities, knights engaged in games and other entertainment. Chess was particularly well liked by the nobility, who saw it as a strategic exercise similar to warfare. Knights playing chess could be a miniature version of a serious intellectual duel. Other board games, such as backgammon and drafts, as well as different dice games, provided entertainment and opportunity for friendly bets on long nights. Other popular leisure pursuits were reading and listening to literature. If a knight was literate, he might read for his own edification from an illuminated manuscript, which could be a religious devotional, a romance, or a chronicle. Having a cleric or knowledgeable companion read aloud from books would be enjoyable even for knights who were illiterate. Professional entertainers like jugglers or acrobats may come to a castle on special occasions to perform risky stunts and tricks, enhancing the spectacle of the host knight's hospitality. That all sounds very wonderful, doesn't it? Jesters, musicians, all that knights drinking and feasting together at the table, swapping stories. Fascination of a bygone era. Knights managed to strike this balance between their demanding responsibilities, leisure time, and cultural activities. In the midst of the routines of peacetime, this leisure kept their spirits uplifted and also their minds active. Now, of course, we have the mind, the spirit, and the soul. Of course, the church had their own obligations for knights. Medieval life was heavily influenced by religion, and knights were supposed to be both skilled fighters and devoted Christians. A knight's daily and weekly routine was interwoven with religious obligations and observances. A knight would frequently attend Mass and start his day with prayer. Within their castle or manor, many knights had a small chapel where services were led by a local priest or resident chaplain. If not, particularly on Sundays and significant holy days, the knight and his household would ride to the closest church. The knight would publicly display his piety at church by kneeling in prayer alongside his vassals and family. The year was punctuated by feast days and festivals of the numerous saints of the church calendar. Following religious ceremonies, knights frequently sponsored or hosted feasts for the villagers, joining their communities in commemorating important holy days like Easter and Christmas. Beyond regular worship, knights were expected to support and uphold the church and society. The knight strengthened his spiritual devotion and his ties to the community through these acts of worship and charity. They took an oath to uphold the teachings of the church and to protect the defenseless, which was regarded as a divinely mandated responsibility of knighthood. But in actuality, Knights supported religious organizations by providing funds or land to churches and monasteries, building chapels, or protecting nearby abbeys. Sincere faith, a sense of feudal duty, and the conviction that these good deeds would contribute to the knight's soul's salvation were the driving forces behind this generosity. Knights made time for personal devotion on a regular basis. They frequently prayed at specific times of the day and read the Bible or a book of saints' lives, or at least had it read to them if they were illiterate. Many would confess their sins to a priest to be absolved, and many observed fasts on specific holy days. Given the inherent violence of his line of work, a knight was frequently especially concerned with obtaining forgiveness and upholding his rightful place in God's eyes. During protracted times of peace, however, some knights made pilgrimages to sacred shrines in their homeland or overseas, places like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem. They did this in order to perform penance, keep their promises, and strengthen their faith. Most maintained close ties to local clergy and saw themselves as lay champions of Christian values, even though only a small number joined military religious orders such as the Knights Templar or Hospitaller, which required monastic vows. For instance, the knighthood ceremony was full of religious symbolism. A squire would usually keep vigil through the night in a church on the eve of being dubbed, praying for guidance and purity before he was officially made a knight. In medieval literature, knights were occasionally referred to as soldiers of Christ, implying that they would be defenders of Christian principles. In times of peace, you had to do this too, and that meant making an effort to be faithful, benevolent, and just, so their swords served both the realm and righteousness. And then we have the tournament. Taking part in tournaments was one of the most well-known manifestations of knightly energy during peacetime. Knights engaged in combat in front of spectators during tournaments, which were elaborate affairs. A tournament may be held by a king or a strong lord to commemorate a milestone, or just simply to let the knights show off their skills, blow off a bit of steam perhaps. Knights from far and wide would travel to the tournament field with their armor, war horses, and squires. They would frequently dress magnificently to leave a lasting impression. Of course, when we think of a tournament, you can't go past the joust, that hallmark competition of these events. During a joust, two knights in armor mounted on horses charged at one another with lances, each attempting to hit the other's shield or dismount his competitor. Points were given for strong hits, and they rode along a divider, the lists, to avoid collisions. Knocking the opponent off the saddle was the ultimate goal. Jousting demanded exceptional courage too, not to mention aim and horsemanship. Even though lances were typically blunted for safety, mishaps did occur. I'm sure you can imagine. But like any sport, it has its dangers. A knight could be hurt by splintered lances or an unfortunate blow. Occasionally it was fatal. The melee, a fictitious conflict in which teams of knights engaged in combat, or it was every man for himself, was another important component of tournaments. Dozens of knights may engage in combat with maces and swords in a disorderly yet regulated setting. It's kind of the same as what we have these days if you've not looked at that medieval combat they have in Europe now. I believe they might have it in the United States, but it's quite entertaining. Although they had marshals directing the battle and adhered to established regulations, the melee still gave knights a taste of the ferocity of battle. Knights could win by being the last fighter standing or by capturing opponents, who would then surrender and be ransomed in accordance with tournament rules. Tournaments were as much social and cultural celebrations as they were combat contests. Both nobles and commoners flocked to see the spectacle in great numbers. Announced by heralds and applauded by supporters, knights would frequently parade into the grounds with vibrant banners and heraldic shields on display. As a source of motivation and pride, they might wear a lady's token of favor, like a ribbon. A tournament victory carried a lot of prestige, too. A winner of a tournament would receive cash payouts, expensive weapons or armor, or exquisite horses as prizes. Certainly something worth fighting for. But more importantly, he gained respect from the general public and recognition from his peers. A successful knight would frequently receive invitations to significant courts, or attract attention of aristocratic families seeking eminent sons-in-law. Another obvious financial advantage was that, in accordance with chivalric tradition, a knight who unhorsed a rival during a joust was entitled to the rival's armor and horse, unless the opponent had paid a ransom to get them back. As a result, talented fighters competing in tournaments might increase their wealth. Tournaments were occasions for celebration in addition to actual combat. Knights and nobles had an opportunity to socialize during the feasts, dances, and ceremonies that accompanied these events. In contrast to war, young knights could learn from veterans, develop friendships, or perhaps rivalries, and establish themselves in a setting that was comparatively safe. Tournaments were valued by their rulers too, as ways of keeping knights occupied and entertained while honing their actual skills for combat. To put it briefly, it was a good thing for them. They enjoyed the competition, excitement, and the platform to exhibit the martial skills that characterized knighthood through jousting and tournaments. It also kept them from getting drunk down at the tavern and causing trouble. Although knights are typically thought of as action-oriented, rather than being intellectually inclined, you might be surprised. They were not without education or intellectual pursuits. The upbringing of many knights included at least a basic education, and in their spare time, some of them developed sophisticated intellectual and cultural interests. Noble children raised to be knights frequently learned more than just fighting skills, even though formal education was uncommon. As squires and pages in noble homes, they learned how to run a household, how to be courteous, and occasionally how to read and write, which was a big deal back then. A young page might read simple texts or religious prayers, with a tutor or the castle's noblewoman to learn his letters. A squire's ability to read simple texts in his native tongue and keep, possibly, accounts by the time in his mid-teens would be helpful to a future landowner. By the beginning of their knighthood, many knights might have what we'd call at least a functional literacy and a familiarity with courtly culture, though not all of them achieved full literacy. As adults, knights frequently continued to pursue intellectual and cultural endeavors, particularly in times of peace. In noble society, a knight was expected to value the arts, music, and literature in addition to fighting. Manuscripts of well-known chivalric romances and epics might be owned or borrowed by knights with literacy. Among the works they enjoyed were heroic, romantic, and adventurous stories about the old characters. Think of Lancelot, Roland, and other mythical heroes. Knights and their families often spent their evenings listening to a cleric or minstrel read aloud these stories. For example, in medieval France, some knights were troubadours who wrote about poetry and songs honoring love and chivalry. In other places, knights themselves became patrons or authors of literature. Knights appreciated practical knowledge, in addition to poetry. In order to navigate the intricate web of nobility and identify friends and enemies in combat, they studied heraldry, which includes coats of arms and family ancestry. Since managing a manor required knowledge of legal contracts, feudal rights, and fundamental finance, they also studied law and administration. A knight with an intellectual bent might occasionally go deeper into learning, studying classical works of history or philosophy, or learning additional languages. A popular one, of course, was Latin for official matters, but perhaps even foreign tongues encountered during travel. A knight frequently sought advice, too, from educated clerks, gaining insights into topics such as estate management, local customs, and even the fundamentals of politics and philosophy. Although warriors rarely attended formal universities, knights could learn by reading any books in their lord's library or talking to an educated clergyman. The characteristics of a courtier, and even a scholar, were being incorporated into the ideal of a knighthood by the late Middle Ages. Therefore, a truly successful knight embodied the idea of the gentleman warrior, being as at ease discussing literature or law as he was brandishing a sword. But on to a little bit of the community relations. As we mentioned at the start, knights had families too. A knight's private life, of course, focused on his family and his home, while public life was dominated by battle and feudal service. In order to gain alliances or property, knights were usually married to women of similarly noble birth. During times of peace, a knight and his spouse collaborated to manage their property and bring up the kids. When the knight was not present, the lady of the house frequently assumed responsibility for managing the household, and that includes supervising the servants, keeping an eye on the food and supplies, and occasionally even managing the finances of the estate. A solid alliance was crucial. In order to maintain daily operations, the knight's wife would step in for him when he had to travel to court or perhaps to a far-off tournament, hopefully not without giving him a little ribbon for good luck. Children were raised to maintain the family's prestige and carry on noble heritage. It was customary for sons of knights to pursue knighthood themselves. A boy may be sent as a page to another lord's castle at an early age, starting a journey akin to his father's. It would be there that he would learn riding, basic literacy, manners, and maybe some combat skills here and there. He became then a squire when he was a teenager, and frequently returned to work for his father or another knight. He assumed greater responsibility as a squire too, taking care of horses, polishing armor, and honing his weaponry skills, until he was judged ready or not to be knighted, which usually happened when he was around 21 years old. A knight took pride in watching his son grow, of course, and making sure he learned the qualities that characterized knighthood, such as bravery, loyalty, and courtesy. Knights' daughters, on the other hand, received education in the expected skills of noble women, including household management, needlework, and fine crafts, possibly too reading and writing, though it's a little hard to tell. When they reached adulthood, their unions would be planned to strengthen the family's ties and reputation. Beyond the immediate family, a knight was the head of a larger household and community. He took great care to ensure his daughters had happy marriages, negotiating with other noble families to secure matches that brought prestige or new connections. Pages, squires, men-at-arms, and domestic servants were all members of his extended family who shared his home. Everyone owed the knight loyalty, and he was in charge of their welfare in exchange. They gave their labor and service, whether it was cleaning the castle, serving at the table, or standing ready in arms, and he gave them food, shelter, protection, and direction. Close ties could exist within a knight's household. Squires and men-at-arms frequently developed a loving, almost paternal attachment to their lord, particularly if he was kind and generous. The knight ruled over the peasant families who cultivated his estates as part of his lordship. He dealt with them on a regular basis during peacetime, collecting rents, hearing petitions, and seeing to their welfare. A shrewd knight recognized that a stable and fruitful realm was synonymous with happy peasants. Protecting the weak and impoverished was one of these chivalric ideals, and many knights took this seriously when it came to local government. In order to prevent oppression or conflict among their people, they attempted to administer justice fairly in the manorial court, and would step in if outside soldiers or bandits threatened their villagers. This could range from something as basic as personally settling a dispute between neighbors to something as significant as planning relief efforts during a famine or plague, i.e., opening the Lord's granary to feed the starving villagers. Together with their household and tenants, knights attended the village church and shared in the worship of holy days, further demonstrating their involvement in the community's spiritual life and well-being. Generous deeds like providing alms to the underprivileged, organizing a festival meal for the entire village, or financing a new parish church roof, perhaps, served to strengthen the bonds of friendship and allegiance between the knight and his subjects. Essentially, a knight served as a protector and caretaker of everyone in his territory during times of peace. His reputation was based on his ability to be a just lord, a good husband, and a responsible father, in addition to his valor in combat. These connections, fostered during times of peace, established a solid base of loyalty and support that would endure the storm of war if it finally returned. In times of peace, a knight's everyday existence was of course a patchwork of duties and roles. When they weren't engaged in combat, they had a wide variety of tasks on the table, managing the lands that supported their livelihoods, and undergoing that intense training to keep their skills sharp. Through polite behavior and devotion to their lords, they participated in courtly society and upheld the chivalric code. In order to make sure their homes and communities thrived, they worked closely with their wives and advisors as estate stewards, and, of course, did their best to be good family men at home. They continued to be pious people who based their deeds on their faith and looked to the church for honor and direction. In their leisure time, they pursued activities that bolstered their minds and spirits: hunting, jousting, supporting arts and education. In addition to being essentially to the stability of medieval society, all of these pursuits helped them to define their own identity. Thus, the reputation of the knight as a noble leader and protector was developed through everyday duties and behavior as much as it was through brutal combat. The quiet heroism of a knight's daily labor, training, governing, and caring for those under his charge, was just as important to the medieval world as was in times of war. They upheld the structure of feudal life and embodied the ideals that we associate with chivalry through their peacetime roles. Even when the swords were all put away, medieval knights earned their place in history by carrying out their duties, preserving the stability and morals of their time. Thank you very much for listening. Didn't we have fun learning about knights? I did. I always have fun recording ones like this. Of course, if you like this sort of content, then you better hit the subscribe button, like the video, and consider supporting on Patreon. Speaking of which, I will thank the top-tier supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Dalvery. As always, I wish you all the best, and I will see you in the next exciting video. Good night, everybody. Lots of love to you all.